My guest this week is Mike Darcey, former COO at Sky, CEO of News International, and currently Chair of British Gymnastics, amongst several other roles. Mike shares his unparalleled experience in pay TV at Sky, with some fascinating insights into the deals that powered Sky Sports coverage of the English Premier League, why choice and functionality have always been at the heart of Sky strategy from its inception, the experience of moving from TV to print, and the way that gymnastics can be a bedrock activity across all sports. We covered a lot of ground, but there was so much insight into the key elements of the business of sport that I had to make this a longer episode than normal. So please enjoy. Hi Mike, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
You have a very long association with gymnastics from your early days. And of course, the thing about gymnastics and other sports of that nature is that often there are moves, the signature moves that seem to be named after people. And so my question to you, based on your early life as a gymnast, would be, what would be the Darcey? What would be a Darcey move in gymnastics?
Oof. Well, the problem is that most of the moves are already named, so I'd have to steal one from somebody else. I was pretty reasonable at the vault, by the time I was retiring, but the big moves are already named. Sukahara is the most famous one. I was better at the handspring front, so maybe I could call that a Darcey, but I don't think I'd be allowed to do that.
Okay, all right. Well, that's fine. It's an open question, but it speaks to the fact that gymnastics was a big part of your early life, and we'll talk about the role that it plays now. But were you a big sports fan? And also, given the fact that later on you were clearly working at Sky and in broadcast for a long period of time, were you a big TV and film fan when you were growing up?
I was always keen on all sport. Sort of the days of rugby and cricket in the end gave way to gymnastics for me. But I was pretty competitive and I loved watching most sport, whether that be live or on TV. And I grew up in New Zealand and, I do remember as a kid, regularly being woken up in the middle of the night by my dad to come down and, watch the FA Cup final on TV, to watch the Wimbledon final on TV. It was very much part of my upbringing that, you sort of watch these iconic events. So I sort of had quite a British education really in my sport very early on, despite growing up 12,000 miles away. And I guess the same is probably true of TV. British television played quite a big part in my upbringing. So I was sort of brought up on not the 9 o'clock news and the Bill and Coronation Street.
What brought you to the UK and what created that first connection with Sky?
I guess like many people from the Antipodean parts, I came to London originally for 2 years overseas experience, as many do, but I also came to do my master's degree in economics at the LSE. But then the 2 years are up and I stayed. Many people have assumed over the years that I sort of came here with News Corp, but in fact, I did not. I came quite independently and I didn't really know anything about News Corp, had no prior relationship. I guess my first contact with Sky is that I became a Sky Sports customer in 1992. But my initial work in the UK was in economic consulting, mainly involving sort of legal and regulatory disputes, so sort of economic expert witness type stuff, before the Competition Commission and those types of bodies. And I did that for about 9 years. And towards the sort of latter part of my time there, I had two principal clients, and they were Sky and BT. And so I was always sort of balancing my time between those two. There was perhaps an inevitability that I might end up working for one of them. And I was pretty pleased that it was Sky that came for me first, which they did in about 98. The surprise to me was that they wanted me to come on board in a strategy role and to set up a strategy team. So that was my my route in. But it was via regulatory disputes was where my connection formed.
So as you say, you joined, having been an external advisor to Sky, you joined the company in 1998 to create a strategy group that became central to the platform's rights acquisition process. And I guess dealing with the Premier League was quite an important component of that. How did those discussions and negotiations evolve over time?
I was at Sky for 15 years, and I tend to sort of, when I think back on that time, the major moments in that tended to be, the 5 Premier League renewals in which I was involved in 2000, 2003, 6, 9, and 12. So they are, sort of quite major points on that journey. I would just slightly take issue with the frame of your question. You talk about discussions and negotiations. That tends to be the way of most sports rights deals, but in large part because of the intervention of the regulator, it was not the case with the Premier League. Certainly by 2003, and to a degree in 2000, it was a highly formalized auction process in which there's no real discussion. It is a sort of sealed bid arrangement. There might be a second round. There is no discussion. There's no, chat about, you're a bit behind, you need to up your bid, which is the game playing that goes on with just about every other sports right I've been involved in. It's always a sort of lots of chat, lots of bluff, lots of, coercion and trying to sort of persuade you that you need to go up. None of that with the Premier League. It really was, you submit a bid, you get a call a couple of hours later to tell you whether you won or you've lost. And certainly in later years, there's a regulator appointed independent person sitting on that call, listening to the conversation and checking it's all being above board. It is a highly formalized process. So there's not a lot of discussion and negotiation. The Premier League does go out to broadcasters trying to sort of drum up interest in the sort of, maybe year ahead of issuing a tender document. So it has meetings with everybody really trying to, encourage them to bid and talk up what a great partnership it would be if they got involved and won and all the rest. And we're always part of that. But as it gets closer to the day, it all goes very quiet. You get sent a tender document and then you've got 4 or 5 weeks to send your bid in, and that's it. So I did it 5 times and they were all very, very different. So in 2000, it was all about the battle on digital and with NTL. And that was the first and only time that the Premier League offered a pack of pay-per-view matches. It was a very short-lived experiment, which didn't work very well. By 2003, on digital had gone bust, and much of the cable industry was in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So it was quite a clear field. But by that time, the regulator was definitely getting involved, and they, for the first time, required the rights to be split into a number of separate packs, which you had to bid separately for. But there wasn't a lot of competition, so Sky won them all. And the regulator was a bit frustrated. So in 2006, the regulator introduced a new rule, which was known as the no single buyer rule, which meant that there were now 6 packs of live matches, but Sky, and indeed anybody else, was not allowed to win all of them. And so that was the arrival of Setanta. They won 2 of the 6 packs. Then in 2009, Setanta had gone bust, and ESPN turned up on the scene, and they picked up 1 pack that Sky wasn't able to win. And then in 2012, it was very different again. And we at Sky were very nervous that Al Jazeera, as they were known as at the time, we now call them beIN Sports, there was a lot of chat that they were going to bid and disrupt the auction and take it all away from Sky. As it turned out, they did not. But that was when BT pitched up and they took 2 of the 7 packs at the time. And that was a major moment in time. And obviously, it was the beginning of a rights war that lasted about another 6 years. So they were all very different. I remember at the end of the first one, it was incredibly stressful. And I remember sitting in a bar afterwards with Vic Wakeling, and we were having a beer, and we both declared to each other that was so stressful, and we were never, ever, ever going to go through that again. And then I did it 4 more times. So I didn't learn.
But clearly there are factors at play here, one of which is very much the regulator. Then there's another factor, which is competitive activity and trying to assess where competitive activity will have an impact on the process. And then there's also, I suppose, the customer and the elasticity of demand that will allow you to then monetize those rights once you acquire them. And so is the process of evaluating the bid a combination of trying to pull all of those factors together into one coherent strategy?
To a degree, but I'll probably give you 2 out of 3 when it comes to the Premier League, which is sort of different to any other sports rights that we looked at. So yes, the competitive situation and the regulator were the 2 really important sort of intertwined things that were going on, and they really were intertwined. They were influencing each other. The regulator was very committed to the idea that they felt there needed to be more competition for Sky. But part of their problem was that they tended to oscillate between 2 quite polar opposite ideas as to how that should come about. So some days they were worried about competition at the retail level, and so they tended to focus on Sky and its supply of its Sky Sports channels to other retailers like the cable companies. But then other days they thought, actually, no, the better way to introduce more competition is not to do that. It's to make it easier for on digital and the cable companies and others to win rights on their own account, and then they compete with Sky Sports at the content level, and then that'll solve the problem downstream as well. And part of the problem is that they tended to jump back and forth between those ideas, but they are in conflict, because if you're a regulator standing in the market declaring that you're going to drive down the wholesale price of Sky Sports, and you're a cable company listening to that, your incentive to bid for the rights is reduced, because you think, well, why would I bother? I'm about to get them on the cheap from Sky Sports, so happy days. So you sit the auction out. But later, if the regulators change their mind and thought, actually, no, this driving down the wholesale price thing isn't working, I need to change tack here, and I need to encourage these people to come into the auction. So it tended to flow back and forth between those 2 ideas. So the competitors were coming and going. Their state of competitive health was varying through time, and what the regulator was trying to do was varying through time. And so all of that sort of drove all those stories. I'm an economist, and so I'm meant to be sort of most excited about the whole thing about the demand curve and elasticity of demand and all the rest. And I guess when I got involved, I thought that was going to be the important stuff. And it turned out not really to be so. And the reason is that in respect to the Premier League, at least, Sky's position in the market and the fact that it was a pay TV operator and the fact that it was vertically integrated meant that it was pretty clear that we could outbid anybody else. If we put down our top number, we were going to win, unless somebody completely irrational showed up. And what that actually meant was that we didn't spend a lot of time worrying about what our top number was. And in fact, I'm not sure I ever worked out how much Sky should pay at the limit, and how you would then exploit that, having paid the maximum number. Overwhelmingly, the job was to try and pay less than that limit. So you look at who else you think is going to be bidding and how much you think you have to bid in order to beat them. So if it's worth 100 to us and you think it's only worth 50 to everyone else, then you're trying to get it for 55 or 60 to give yourself a margin for error. You don't worry about whether it's 100 or 95 or 105. You're focused overwhelmingly on analyzing that sort of 50 mark. So, through those years, I probably spent far more time analyzing the business models of other people than I did analyzing ours, and trying to work out what others could rationally pay, and then making sure we try to outbid that.
You wrote a really fascinating article recently about the IPL rights negotiations or auction in India, and how the BCCI may have rewritten the rule book a little bit in terms of slicing and dicing rights by distribution mechanism, which sounds like something that was kind of mooted around about this time in the UK. And so it's really interesting to think that we've never been in a situation where you have the same rights, but being able to be accessed in different ways. I think, in fact, in the article, you said that there was a robust exchange of views in which, on behalf of Sky, you said that was the stupidest idea I'd ever heard because there really was only one exclusive right. Is the way that rights are being traded now going to change a little bit, and there is going to be more complexity than the kind of process that you talked about for the Premier League, which was pretty much, set out by a regulator, and you turn up and put your bid in, and 2 hours later you find out?
I guess I would say that the BCCI process is one of the most Premier League-like processes out there, in the sense that it is quite formal and it is very much a sort of sealed blind auction. And yes, there's chat leading up to it about getting people all geared up, but then a very comprehensive tender document is published, and you know exactly what the packages are that are going to be licensed, and you know what the rules are, and there's not going to be any discussion. That tender document, this is the contract you are going to sign if you win, and there's not going to be a lot of discussion. This is it. So decide what you're bidding, which is very like the Premier League days. So that is quite a formal process. But I think the really novel thing about this one, certainly for a very large right, is, as you say, the fact that they sold 2 versions of the live right, differentiated by sort of the form of technological delivery. So there's a streaming right and there's a broadcast right. And we're about to find out if I was completely wrong 22 years ago, when I asserted the Premier League that there is only one live right, and you can't sell it twice. Or you can, but then you're no longer selling an exclusive right. You're selling non-exclusive rights. And if that's what you want to do, fine. But then, the value is going to crash. Now, I think it's probably too early to tell. It's possible that we will see that the BCCI, having sold 2 versions of the live right to 2 different people, we will now see several years in which they bite chunks out of each other, price crashes, and the revenue opportunity is destroyed by, sort of over-aggressive competition between 2 people trying to sell the same thing. In which case, we'll all go back to the version that I asserted back in 2000. But maybe we won't. Maybe we will find that you can sell 2 versions of the live right, and that the distinction between streaming and a broadcast right is sufficiently large that they are 2 different things, and they can sit alongside each other, and they can chase potentially different pools of prospective subscribers without getting in each other's way, and they can avoid a sort of ruinous price competition, and they can both make good money. And if that does happen, then I think sports rights bodies around the world are going to sit up and take notice and go, gee, maybe I should do some of that. Because, they've been living with this mantra for a long time, that you only get to sell the live right once. They are a bit worried that the degree of broadcast competitive intensity might be declining. And they've sort of wondered, maybe I can get the streamers involved and get them competing with my broadcasters to try and recreate some competitive intensity. But this is potentially a different path. And say, well, I can sell it to both. And if I've got a bit of competition amongst the streamers and I've got a bit of competition amongst broadcasters, then I get to have my cake and eat it. So I think it's an extremely important moment. I would say that because I wrote the article.
So when it came to adding new sports rights, whether it was Champions League or Test cricket, how did you evaluate adding in extra rights to a very strong football proposition?
Yeah, so once you go outside the Premier League, then the whole process does become perhaps a lot more analytical, and it was a lot more about our business model. In the end, if you have an existing base and you have an existing sports proposition with the Premier League at the core and some other things, then if you're faced with the potential to add a new sports right, then you have to ask and answer a number of questions. And the central question is, given where I start today, if I were to add this new sports right, how many additional subscribers do I think I would acquire? And you have to bear in mind that some of the fans of this new sports right may already be your subscribers, so they don't really count. Although their propensity to churn might decline, so you might want to take account of that. But really, what you're interested in, how many fans will newly be swayed to become your customers where your prior proposition has not been enough to get them over the line. So you were trying to work out that, then you need to understand how much a new subscriber is worth and whether the addition of a new right could maybe justify a price increase to your sports tier. But also, if these customers come, what other content might they take? What other services are they going to take? And that became more complex when things like broadband came along. But then you have to add in other elements for ad revenue and revenue from pubs and clubs and revenue from wholesaling, your newly enhanced sports channels to the other distributors. And then you need to set all of that against the counterfactual of, well, if I don't acquire this right, where else does it go? And what happens to it? And does that cause me any damage because it appears in some exclusive proposition elsewhere, and maybe some of my subscribers leave because you're interested in the difference between this counterfactual world and this world in which you're acquiring the right. And then even once you've sort of worked all that out, that sort of tells you what's the maximum you should be willing to bid if pushed. Then, you're always asking, as for the Premier League, but do I actually need to pay that much, or could I get it for less? And so you are back to evaluating other people. And I guess in the earlier developing years of Sky, it was slightly more complicated because you had various sports rights that for many years had been on free-to-air television and who weren't necessarily going to award you the right simply because you offered £1 more than the BBC, that there was a value attached to the breadth and reach that a terrestrial broadcaster could provide. And so you had to have a sense of what level of premium you might need to offer in order to persuade that rights owner to take the plunge and go pay TV. Now that sort of declined through time as Sky and Sky Sports became larger and people got more used to making that choice, but it was a significant factor. So a great deal of analysis, and we got better at it as more data. The Sky model allowed us access to more data, and we became more sophisticated at generating it and using it.
Which it's interesting because of the broader developments in football. So the Champions League was on Sky Sports for several years, and then has been off Sky Sports and has been on BT for some time, and it will be now coming onto Amazon as well. So there must be quite a lot of analysis that goes on in the Sky world to say we're not prepared to add those rights because the return doesn't make sense, but we are prepared to have those rights out there and run the risk that potential subscribers could go elsewhere, or even we might suffer more churn as a result because those rights are getting bigger, the number of games are getting bigger, the profile of it is getting bigger. So there's obviously quite a lot of analysis that goes on to inform that decision.
Yeah, so when Sky lost the Champions League rights, I think they were pretty upset. That was not the plan. I mean, there are plenty of scenarios of late where Sky has let particular rights go. They've decided, the level of competitive interest in it is such that I think I'd rather just avoid the fixed cost and it can go, and I don't think it'll hurt me. That was not the case at the time for the Champions League. They really did not want it to go, but it did. And then what they found was that they were not hurt as much as they feared. And then slightly the problem becomes for somebody like UEFA that once you've taken it off Sky, if they find that they didn't really get hurt very much, then their motivation to push the boat out to take it back again is pretty modest. And that's what's happened. And that's happened again just recently, in the sense that BT, who used to be paying around 400 million a year, is now brought the number down to about 300 million a year, and Sky has still not sought to get involved in that. So the price is coming down, and Sky still seems quite happy to not get involved, shrug its shoulders, and said, "Look, we're fine with that." And part of the key to that is like in the old days, if you're a Sky and you lost a sports right on digital or to cable, you were pretty confident that it was going to be exclusive to on digital and exclusive to cable. That is what happened. And then because most households only chose one platform, the risk is that a dedicated fan of that right leaves Sky in its entirety and adopts this new platform in order to acquire exclusive access to this right. We're sort of forgotten those days. I mean, it was so fundamental that was the dynamic, but it's sort of gone. And in part, it went in 2018 or so when Sky and BT agreed a sort of Peace in the Valley cross-supply deal in which BT Sport is carried on the Sky platform, and Sky is the retailer of that. So Sky, from that day, worries even less about having to regain the Champions League, because it looks at that and thinks, well, I could spend a lot of money. I could spend 300-400 million a year owning that, when in fact my customers have already got access to it. It's just there on the platform. It's listed on the EPG. They can pay for it if they want it. If they don't want it, then they ignore it. It's fine. So once there's cross supply, then the threat of losing something like that becomes a lot less. And so Sky still seems pretty relaxed about that. And yes, the Champions League has expanded and there's more teams, but really you had quite a few teams and now you've added extras. By definition, you're adding more marginal teams at the bottom. I mean, it's slightly more complicated than that, because if England gets a fifth pick, then that's attractive.
Yep.
But I think it's quite a margin improvement in the attractiveness of the competition, and I think all the evidence is that Sky is pretty relaxed about that.
So you spent 6 years as COO of Sky, and you were responsible for many areas of the business. At what point did Sky feel that it needed to engage with customers across functionality like DVR, HD, and then delivery, broadband, Sky Go, and original content, and therefore the reliance on particularly sport and to some extent movies started to reduce?
That was in the thinking very, very early, long before I was COO, I would say, certainly right back at the beginning of my time in a strategy role. I mean, if you go back to DVRs or PVRs as we called them at the time, Sky introduced Sky Plus in about 2001, I think. And that was after several years of development. And that was long before most people knew what a PVR was or remotely understood that they might want one. Indeed, that was the challenge, trying to persuade somebody that this is something that they would value if they got it in their home. But we felt that was important, and we pushed it very, very hard, despite the fact that all the consumer research says, no, we don't want this, we don't care, we don't even understand it. So we ignored all that and said, look, we think this is important, and we pushed ahead. And I think that was in the DNA of Sky right from the beginning. Sky, I think in the end, Sky was all about choice. And that's what a PVR provides you. It provides you with choice and control. And I think that was more deeply in the DNA before sport was. So yes, the manifestation of it came in 2001, but I think the instincts were there right from the beginning. I think HD was similar to a degree, in the sense that I would say that Sky drove the introduction of HD into the UK as soon as it was technically possible, and as soon as you could see that there would be some content available in HD, because the US studios in particular were releasing movies in HD. And we did that at a time when most of the UK industry thought that HD was a complete waste of time. So we were very much pushing against a sort of UK industry view. But in the end, the industry came along, and it seems odd now to look back and think people thought that HD wasn't really necessary, improved picture quality, why would we bother with that? But I think it was quite sort of deep in the Sky mentality that, the viewing experience was fundamental. And if it could be improved, then, that could be a key part of the story. So I think the fact that, Sky's instinct was to look for those bits of potential for technological improvement and get ahead of them and make them part of the Sky story before others got on board, and make them, yes, another reason why people might come to Sky and then stick with Sky. And having sort of laid out that paradigm, I'll then say that broadband was entirely different. That was never part of the plan. that came completely later. But around, I think probably 2004, 2005, I think we were, starting to have to accept that the cable industry was getting serious traction with this idea called triple play, which we thought was crazy. Why did triple play matter? It was an artificial bundle. Surely consumers were smart enough to just go out and buy best of breed, you just buy your best broadband provider if that's what you want, and you take your best TV provider. And yet time and again in consumer research, we'd hear, yeah, Sky probably is best for TV, but in the end, I've gone for the triple play because you get the broadband in there as well. And we'd hear that, we go, what? Why are you doing that? But after a while, you have to accept, but that's what consumers are doing. And so you need to accept this is a thing, and you need to do something about it. We were also, around the same sort of time, accepting, I think perhaps earlier than people would tend to assume, that on-demand was going to be a very important part of the future, and that a PVR was great, and it would take us a long way, but it was not the ultimate answer. And that satellite was not well suited to on-demand. And we needed a solution to that, or in some period, whether it be 5 or 10 years' time, we were going to have a problem. And so we needed to fix that. And so the answer to both of those questions was that we needed to get involved as a broadband operator. I think for a satellite operator to do that, that was quite a radical idea, but it was, as I say, a response to a current problem and an expectation that a problem was coming 5 or 10 years down the line, and that you could have all the sport you liked, but the evidence was that those problems would get you in the end. So there were other things you had to be doing. Around a similar time, though, we started to worry, this is in the mid-2000s, we started to worry that simply relying on renting content from others, but in particular the Premier League and some others like that, was an inherently unstable position. And there was nothing you could do about the fact that one day it could be taken away from you if somebody turned up with more money. And if that was such a fundamental foundation stone of the business and you didn't have anything else, then that was just a very, very vulnerable place to be. And so we took the long-term view that Sky needed to develop a strong position in original content, something that in the end couldn't be taken away from you because you created and owned the IP and you had the library. The problem was that unlike broadband, there was no sort of quick path to a solution to that. It was going to take 10, 15, 20 years of concerted effort. And that was 17, 18 years ago that I think that conclusion was reached, and Sky's been on that journey ever since. Sky thought about these things that sport in the Premier League was not enough pretty early, a lot earlier than most people started to think it about Sky.
In many ways, movies and sports were seen as the two pillars of pay TV in those early years. But over time, it does feel that sport and Premier League in the UK particularly sort of took on another level of importance. You were involved in renewing and extending those movie output deals. Could you have imagined when you were involved in these discussions that those studios would ultimately go down the direct-to-consumer route and would want to effectively hold back some of their content to power those services, and therefore it would create a supply and dealing with the sort of rental issue that you mentioned earlier?
My sense was always that the studios were on a path of trying to slice and dice their rights to extract more value from them. And they were always frustrated that they weren't making enough money. And we thought that they often must wonder whether they should go it alone. They were on a different path at the time. And I personally think they were on a path that gradually devalued the product that we were paying for. When we first got involved, we were licensing the pay window, and it was a very distinctive and powerful thing. But then gradually it got chipped away at. And so it was like a sort of pincer movement from both sides that, when you try to ask people, well, why aren't you subscribing to movies, or why aren't you watching it? Or some were saying, well, I've already seen it on DVD, or I watched it on pay-per-view, or, it's like, it's an old movie. And then other people were saying, well, I don't really need to because it'll be on ITV in a year. So, why would I pay? And then VOD arrives and download to own arrives. And it was sort of slice and dice so much that, there just wasn't really just all the bits, I think gradually got devalued. And by contrast, sport held its value, and if anything, became more distinctive through time. But there was this sort of building frustration amongst the studios. I think that the more they did, the more frustrated they got. And we often, would game out. Well, if we fail to do a deal with this particular studio and we've got 5 and one's on the outside, what will they do? And so we thought, would they go on their own, form a movie channel of their own, and that sort of thing. And we tended to think that was very unlikely. And one of the reasons it was unlikely was that they simply didn't have the consumer-facing brand to do that, with one exception. So whenever we did that analysis, we always dismissed the risk for 5 of them and worried a bit about Disney and thought, look, if anyone has the brand, they have the brand. Now, in the end, in the days of linear movie channels, they never did that. But in the streaming area, it will have been of no surprise to Sky, and certainly no surprise to me having left there, that it was Disney who jumped first. If anybody can do that, it is them, because they have that strength of brand and that consumer brand recognition. So it did take until the advent of the streaming era for them to make that step. But strangely enough, having got annoyed at Sky and other licensees for not paying them enough when they kept slicing the movie into 27 different windows. Now that they're exploiting the movies on their own account, they just like it all in one window. They just want it all appearing in Disney Plus. They're not even sure they want it in the cinema. So the model that they applied to the rest of the world and got frustrated by, now that it's them actually in charge of the monetization of the consumer end, they've sort of worked out that actually it's better to have a really clear proposition. Say, if you want to watch this movie, here it is.
In January 2013, the request of Rupert Murdoch, you made the move into print and became CEO of News International. Was that daunting and exciting? Did you think that you could bring some of the learnings from pay TV over to News International?
Yeah, look, it was daunting and exciting. That's a pretty good summary. I had not worked in newspapers, and I did, wonder at the beginning, perhaps Rupert had forgotten that I'd had dealings with him over so many years, and we'd spent so much time together. When he first was bringing it up, I said, Rupert, you do remember I have only worked for you in pay TV. I haven't done newspapers. He didn't seem to worry about that. He had remembered that, and he did not worry. So it was new to me. It was the time, still dealing with the reverberations around the phone hacking scandal. Rebecca Brooks had stepped down and was, along with others, was going to be facing charges. The News of the World had shut. The Leveson inquiry was underway. There was talk of the need for a new, perhaps government-approved press regulator. But then beyond phone hacking, journalists were still being arrested most weeks at the time on suspicion of paying public officials for stories. As was pointed out to me by Rupert and Robert Thompson at the time, if I took this job, I would become personally responsible for page 3 and would be hated by my daughter, my wife, and every other female I knew. To say nothing of the existential challenge to the economic model underpinning print newspapers. So other than that, it looked like a pretty easy gig. Some people thought I was completely mad that I was going to take this role, but I think others got it, and they understood just the attractiveness of doing something different and something challenging to sort of test yourself in a different environment.
And would you say the biggest success, both of your time and just generally, of the organization is to re-establish and maintain the concept that great quality content should be paid for?
Yes. And well, although, half. Because that was the idea when I went. News Corp was keen to pursue a paid-for strategy at the time. And that was something for which I was a pretty good fit. I was familiar with how to run a subscription business, issues to do with pricing and bundling and customer acquisition, and churn management, and what a proposition needs to look like if it is to be paid for. And we did some interesting things. We bid for football clips and then clips for other sports rights and that sort of thing, and wrapped that into a broader bundle. And we were making pretty good progress. Look, I didn't start this, but I definitely reinforced it. The model at the Times and the Sunday Times, which operated what was referred to as a hard paywall, and that has been very successful. So that's worked well for the Times and Sunday Times. That's fully embedded for them and for many other quality titles around the world now as the best way to run the business. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Times became profitable on my watch. The joke around the building was it was the first time it had turned a profit since the war, and they weren't talking about the Second World War. It was a reference to the Crimean War. Now, I'm not sure if that's actually factually accurate, but it was quite a turnaround. That in the most difficult of circumstances, the Times was now, for the first time in a very long time, now making a profit. So that's a business model change that's worked very well. It was always going to be tougher for the Sun, and there were many more questions around whether that was the right thing to try to do for the Sun, as it would have been for any other tabloid. And there are many reasons for that, but those propositions have a greater reliance on celebrity news and gossip and the like, and that is content that was increasingly becoming widely available for free. And so a key part of the proposition was out there for free. But at the beginning, News Corp was very committed to the idea, and so I was up for it. And they were very committed until they weren't. And in the end, I think they sort of lost their nerve. I think they were spooked a bit by the success of Mail Online and the numbers it was doing. Not that it was making a profit, but they were certainly doing attractive numbers in terms of weekly users and the like. And that is something that in the end News Corp found difficult to ignore. And so in the end they executed a fairly sharp U-turn on that. And about then it was probably time for me to head off, because in the end I think I'm a paid for guy rather than a free guy. So that was me done.
So you've got a number of board and advisory positions now, and one of those is a role as chair of British Gymnastics. And to bring back to where we came in, it's an incredibly popular sport, and it's always a sport that really peaks around the Olympics. One of the sports that always gets an enormous amount of attention. It's had some challenges with some negative stories around it. How can gymnastics use that platform that the Olympics gives it?
Yes, it does. It does rather soar into the national consciousness every 4 years, and then can go a little bit quiet in between. I mean, look, I would say that the BBC is a great partner of British Gymnastics, and they're a great partner at Olympics time. But also they do pretty good work for us in between. Broadcasting other key events, like the World Championships and other significant tentpole events in between. But there definitely is potential to try to do more, and there's some digital models being explored now, in potentially in conjunction with other Olympic-funded sports who suffer from a similar sort of issue. There's plenty going on, but we pay attention to them once every 4 years, and yet there is much more to say in between time, and maybe we need to explore the economies of scope across that. So that sort of thing is being explored. That said, I didn't get involved again in gymnastics because I wanted to help Max Whitlock win another gold medal. I'd be very happy for him if he does, and that'll be great, and others in his footsteps. I'm more focused myself on, there are around just shy of 400,000 members of British Gymnastics training in a little over 1,500 clubs around the country. And some of those end up in a competitive pyramid and work their way up through the performance regime, and great. And that's a world that I existed in as well. But I think I'm as focused, or maybe more focused, on the participation base, and the fact that I have strong views about the benefits of gymnastics as a foundation sport, and how a kid can get huge value from spending even just 2-3 years in the sport, in terms of the physical literacy that they develop, in terms of balance and strength and confidence and agility and coordination and all these things. I think there are very, very few sports that are as helpful as that. And if they go on to then, find other sports, then I think they sort of carry those early skills with them. And so that's a key focus for me. And for those kids or people participating at any age, yes, it's part of the attraction is that they see these big name gymnasts, their heroes on TV, and that is part of the attraction. But it's not the whole story. We shouldn't, say it's absolutely important. I think kids around the country, love to do gymnastics for itself, and to be with their mates and they have a good time and they get a sense of achievement out of that. So I'm keen to push that.
Well, I always like to end with something a little light. And as this is really a podcast focusing on the sports side, and we've had some lockdowns and COVID doesn't seem to have gone away, but thankfully we haven't had any lockdowns lately. But if you did find yourself in another one and you could have a tape or a file of your 3 greatest sporting moments, which ones would you choose?
Yeah, you warned me about this, and I thought this is hard because there are so many. I've watched a lot of sport live and I've watched a lot of sport on TV, and I am an avid watcher. You could just ask my wife. So really, really hard to narrow it down. And what I did in the end was I've gone for 3, and in all 3 cases I was at the event live, and so I've never seen them on TV. So it might be quite nice to go back and enjoy the experience from the TV angle of something I saw. And now that I know the outcome, I could at least watch it in a relaxed fashion because I don't need to worry, as I probably was doing at the time. So the first one I picked is Chelsea beating Bayern Munich in the Champions League final in Munich, where I was there as a guest of UEFA. What is the German word for Schadenfreude? Anyway, it was very amusing. I think UEFA probably had 400 guests there that day, and I think there were 10 of us wearing blue and everybody else was supporting Bayern Munich. So it was quite a night. The second one would be Super Saturday at the 2012 Olympics in London, which was just a fantastic experience. I mean, that was just a day that, we looked at the schedule in advance, thought, oh, that could be an interesting evening, applied for tickets, got 4 tickets for the family, all went. And it's just one of those moments in time that you'll never forget that night. I think the kids will probably never forget that night. And then I have to do a rugby one. So I have to do an All Blacks one, I think. And there are so many. But I think I'd go for the 2015 World Cup final at Twickenham, where I was in attendance beating the Australians 34-17. And what was quite a comfortable victory in the end, I think. So all of those I was there, all of those I would happily watch again on the TV, and I could probably watch quite a few times, as I say, in a more relaxed fashion than I was experiencing at the time.
Very good. Well, Mike Darcey, thank you so much for being a guest. It's been fascinating. And I know personally I'll be looking out for all of your future posts on LinkedIn that give an amazing insight into what's happening in the world of sports, and I would encourage all of my listeners to do the same. So
thank you. There are a few in the pipeline.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Okay. See you then.